Hello and welcome to Close Quarter. Today I'm joined by Mark Schauss, who is Managing Director, Binding Authority at Markel. Today we'll be discussing the evolution of insurance pricing for small business. Mark, insurers have been pricing risk for centuries. How different is this process now than it has been historically?
Well, first of all, thank you for being here. Pricing insurance today versus centuries ago really fundamentally at its core is not all that different. Insurers seek to leverage the concept of the law of large numbers to best predict future outcomes. For those of you who haven't opened an insurance textbook in a while, the law of large numbers is this concept where you flip a coin 5 times and you might even be able to convince yourself that, hey, tails never fails. But you flip that same coin about 1,000 times and pretty quickly you'll start to see that really it is a 50-50 scenario. So over the decades, insurers have been refining this approach and looking for new ways to develop the law of large numbers to better predict outcomes. Today, the big difference is, we just have so much more computing power and we can make that much more seamless than we could have decades ago and think of new ways and how to approach that.
Absolutely, yeah. How does pricing commercial insurance for small businesses compare to pricing for large corporations or pricing for other lines of insurance?
So that's a great question. I think that's one that's almost underestimated in the nuance to it. So I'll take a couple different types of insurance and, say personal lines. So it's fairly easy to kind of create those homogeneous concepts with personal lines. You're usually insuring people's personal auto or their home. But that puzzle becomes a little bit more complex when you start to really get down granular with the different characteristics that can differentiate really the more preferred risks from the tougher risks within that segment. So, what might have been important, decades ago, hey, what type of car are you driving? Now it's more about the telematics or maybe even that individual driver's credit score that might be more predictive of how they're going to be as a driver. If you compare that to, say, large corporations in of themselves tend to come with a lot of experience. And when I say experience, typically what I mean there is loss experience. So big businesses, they've got kind of a past history that it allows the pricing of their insurance to rely on existing data that's specific to that large corporation, which is unique and really a great resource for pricing large businesses. On the flip side, when we talk about small business, it's kind of interesting. Really, on average, only about 1 to 3% of small businesses have an insurance claim in any given year. So when you think about it, a lot of times that loss information or that loss experience is not going to be available, or you can almost hope it's not available. So historically, for small businesses, we've used the approach of starting with the business's operations to really kind of determine, where we wanted to start that journey and start to characterize the insured.
So, yeah. How much has technology and the data available changed in recent years, and how much of a challenge is it for carriers to utilize that?
So I think this is a great question. I think this is really where the rubber meets the road. So today there is an abundance of data. The amount of data is wild. It's so interesting because a lot of the data is not even coming from legacy insurance operations or it's third-party scenarios that happen to have certain data sources, and they're really going around to whether it's hospitals or banks or insurance companies and saying, hey, can you do anything with this? And that's really where the challenge is. And the other thing that makes it fairly unique today that is very different than in the past are API technologies. So our ability to use a web call to fairly instantaneously tap in and get a return on a specific data point. So not only do we have an abundance of data available, but we also have the ability to kind of put this at our fingertips very quickly. Now, here's where the challenge comes in, and this is where I think a lot of insurance companies are really starting to try to figure out how best to use this data. Let's just use an example, and we see these today where maybe you can get an image of a roof. And so you can be underwriting a risk and you can see an image of a roof, or maybe it's in California and it's somewhat wildfire exposed, and you can see the clearance distance between the structure itself and the nearest brush. Well, that's really cool. And that does tell you some type of information, but how do we structure underwriting strategy around that image? You know, that distance between that structure and that brush, does that distance represent, hey, we should, you know, increase our loss cost factor by, you know, 10%, 25%? Should we decline the risk altogether? These are things that are really difficult for insurers to really start to quantify and be able to put into underwriting action. One of the other difficulties when it comes to this type of information and this data that's available is it becomes difficult to retrospectively map this information. So a lot of times we want to look back and see, well, how did similar buildings with similar clearance from brush perform in past wildfires? Well, if we don't have those images from a wildfire that happened 8 years ago, it's really hard for us to quantify exactly how that should be priced and integrated into the pricing strategy. The other thing that always just makes insurance complicated is oftentimes there's a long tail nature to a lot of this. You know, so we're trying to make decisions, and while the, you know, data's coming at us, you know, at an increasing amount in the more recent years, a lot of times we're just finally getting to know how business performed that we wrote a couple, maybe 5-10 years ago. So there's really just kind of a long tail to this that really just adds an extra layer of complication.
Sure. Just then building on everything we've discussed so far, how is the process for pricing small business insurance evolving now?
That's really interesting. And I would say, believe it or not, I almost think that there's kind of two competing forces in the small commercial pricing world right now. I think there's one force that's trying to simplify the distribution process. Let's be honest, your typical small business is not really looking forward to their insurance purchasing process. It's something that they typically just want to get done. They want to make it as simple, as straightforward as possible. They just want to make sure that they feel like they got a good deal and that they're covered. So from a distribution and an efficiency of that distribution process, there's a desire for it to be simplified, for it to be streamlined and efficient. Think about buying an airline ticket today. You can go on a number of different websites. You type in your origin city, your destination, your dates, and it right there pops up all the different flights that are available that meet your criteria, and it's pretty standardized. On the flip side, as an insurance company, we're constantly trying to seek ways to better price to the profile of the risk. So the more we can know about a certain risk, the more we can get the price down for the preferred risks and price appropriately for the higher exposed risks. So there's a tug and pull there. So I think really the key is how can insurers get that information that they need about a specific insured to make those decisions to quite frankly, put the customer in a position where they're almost able to somewhat self-determine if they're getting a lower price or a higher price based off of their own risk characteristics without making the whole process a burden. So it's all about how can we make that efficient and easy for that purchasing without having to penalize the insured and just say, hey, because we don't know all this stuff, you're going to get a higher rate as a result of that.
Sure, yeah. And why then is an evolved approach required today?
So it's important that there's an evolved approach today. Quite frankly, if you want to survive profitably as an insuring entity, because those who can get to that more granular approach will allow them to, kind of going back to a textbook term here, will allow them to minimize their adverse selection. So those that are able to price for those preferred risks based off of characteristics that they've learned will ultimately lead to a lower exposure, less losses, will attract those more preferred insureds, quite frankly, leaving the non-preferred insureds out there for the rest of the companies to fight over at what likely initially will be, quite frankly, a deficient price.
Sure, yeah. Just lastly then, what does the future look like for the pricing of insurance for small businesses?
The future of pricing for small businesses, I think, is extremely exciting. When you just think of just the sheer nature of small business and the diversity of it, There's so many different types of businesses, whether they're, contractors, manufacturers, hospitality, you name it. There's just such a wonderful spectrum, and it's constantly evolving. So small businesses today will look very different 5-10 years from now, and so will the approach to pricing them. Data is going to get more plentiful. We're going to get better at how we apply this data, hopefully in a very seamless way to make the process an enjoyable process, or a little bit more enjoyable. We have software now that allows us to look at things in a multivariate way, ways that just quite frankly make it much more price appropriate for the insurance. So I'm excited to see a scenario where it's going to be small businesses that are getting and paying for the insurance that most accurately represents all the hard work that they put into their business.
Great. Well, Mark, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Michael.